The second scripture lesson today comes from the Gospel of Mark, from chapter 8. I'll be reading verses 31 through 36. And again, as always, you can follow along on the screens. You can use your own personal Bible or pew Bible. But let's together hear the word of God. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said all this quite openly, and Peter then took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter, and he said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on divine things, but on human things." Jesus then called the crowd with his disciples, and he said to them, "If anyone wants to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow. For those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. Now, when you came in this morning and you began to walk down the aisles and found your place, and you saw those peculiar palm fronds placed in the pews, tell the truth. How many people thought it was Palm Sunday? Come on. Okay. You're close. A few days away, a few weeks away. It's not Palm Sunday, but we've been in this series called The Sacred Heart of Palm Reading. And one of the things I asked Jody when he first came here, what do you want to learn? What do you want to know? And so he said, well, I want to know how you put these series, how these ideas come up and how you put them, into play and be able to preach on them on Sunday morning. So we went into the conference room, and in the conference room, there's a big whiteboard. So I took that whiteboard and I drew this sort of, I confess, I'm not an artist, okay? But I drew this thing, kind of like I'm drawing now. I was making my best impression of a palm tree, right? Looks like a palm tree, doesn't it? Thank you. Not convinced, right? To you, it looks like the back of a board. Okay, so I draw this palm tree, and I could tell, kind of funny look on his face. He's like, uh-oh, I could have gone to another church, and I came to this one. So I began to explain it all to them, that how I was interpreting imagery to help make points, to help us understand God's word. Jesus always talked and taught in stories, tangible things. So I began to talk about the palm tree, and together we came up with this idea of title of The Sacred Heart of Palm Reading. So that's how we got here. We're going to see where it goes as we continue to worship. I began talking a little bit last week about the American dwarf palm or cabbage palm, and I talked about how that very palm tree can provide a really good landscape. How many people have palm trees in their yard? We did this last week, and a lot of people have them, right? So yeah, we love that in Florida. It gives us, looks very tropical, and we like that look. It's interesting. It creates good sunblock, creates some shade. And of course, the palm frond is quite interesting, isn't it? If you think about all kinds of leaves and the things we have in Florida, the plants we have, the palm leaf is quite interesting. It's aesthetically pleasing as we try to look at it. When it's green, it's wonderful. Not so much when it starts to fade into the death cycle. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Great sunblock, good at creating shade, but blocking the sun also provides an environment for little creatures that love to live here in Florida. Especially they love to live in those dark, kind of moist, shadow life cultures. Guess what grows under the palm leaf? If you paid attention to this children's message, you probably are a little bit ahead of me, but under the shadow of the palm frond is a perfect environment for things that need darkness to grow. They need it to grow, they need it to propagate, they need it to thrive. And some of these shadow organisms, they're not very dangerous, although I do ask you, make sure she washes her hands, okay? Just saying. So they're not dangerous. We talked about the fungus on the bottom part of the leaf, fungus and mold. And if you have these plants in your yard, go home today, look underneath the leaf, that's what you'll find. It'll be growing there because fungus and mold love shade, they love darkness, they love moisture, all those things. And of course, there's the creature I talked about last week, the Periplaneta americana. Do you remember that? Wonderful, isn't it? Also known as the palmetto bug, right? The palmetto bug, talked about that. They get their names because guess where they live? Underneath the palm fronds, right? Palmetto bugs. By the way, little known fact, probably the largest insect to invade your house. They can be as long as 1.5 inches long, so just be aware of all of that. And I said they do love to live in the palm fronds, so I hope before you sat down in one of those pews that had a palm frond, you check carefully just to make sure. I did. I looked, okay. I even had it locked up in my trunk overnight, so you're safe. Those things, roaches, palmetto bugs, they can't really hurt us. They might creep us out a bit, but they can't hurt us. But there are some creatures that live underneath those palm fronds which actually can hurt us. And I can tell you from personal experience, when I'm in my yard working, I have to be very careful. I discovered the hard way. Wasps love to live underneath palm fronds. And I was in trimming one day and I disturbed a huge nest. And so, again, they can't kill you, but it was quite unpleasant to get stung, and I didn't like that. So then there's a few creatures. There are few creatures that live under the palm frond, especially when it's going through its death cycle, which can hurt us. Some of these creatures can actually kill us, like Florida's most beautiful and most venomous, most deadly snake. You know what it's called? Coral snake. How do you know? You can practice the little saying later. Now, again, I know that wasps live under these palm fronds. I've disturbed them, gotten stung. I also know coral snakes live under them because I picked up a palm frond at my house, and guess what was under it? Coral snake. So I've had 2 of them at my house, as a matter of fact. So they do live there, and they have the bite is quite deadly if you get bit. Now, here's the landscaping fact. Landscaping 101. Expose the landscaping to the light, and it removes that darkened environment, right? Expose to the light, pick up the palm frond, it removes the environment. Those little creatures will go find someplace else in your yard to live. Now, when we start talking about this series called The Sacred Heart of Palm Reading, it means this today. If we pay attention and learn to read the signs, to read the palm, all those different aspects I originally drew up on the board, we learn to read those, I think we can learn something important about ourselves and about God through something as simple as, today, a palm frond. So what does the palm frond reveal? I can't wait till you go tell your friends what the pastor talked about today. My pastor talked about palm fronds. What did your pastor talk about? I don't know. But we're going to talk about palm fronds. What is it? What does it reveal? Okay, those of you who have a palm frond in your pew, please pick it up. Grab one by hand. Yes, you actually have to touch this today. There you go. You got your palm frond. Everybody have their palm frond. Now hold your palm frond up over your head, making a shadow. Now, look around. See the shadows the lights are casting on everybody? Put your hand underneath it and see it. You're creating a shadow. So what does the palm reveal? Thank you. You can put them down now. By the way, you can have those. Just take them home with you. If you want to cultivate an environment of coral snakes, just take them home, lay them out in the yard. It'll happen for you. But it creates a shadow environment, doesn't it? So what do we learn? That's very good in Florida. It's good to have palms. It's good to have nature. But when this type of darkened environment if we use that as kind of an analogy, is applied to human life, a darkened environment in human life, it has really important side effects in our lives. If those shadow conditions can create some life that's not so good under the palm for us, maybe if we can extrapolate that out, maybe there's parts of us living under the shadow that may not be good for us. So the question is this: if we leave the shadow areas alone, let's just say whatever he's talking about, I don't get it, or maybe I don't want to look, or I don't want to expose anything in my life to the light. I like it right where it is. It's fine. If we leave the shadow areas alone in our lives, which I think a lot of us do, including me, will they get better, meaning healthier, or will they remain the same? What do you think? This isn't rhetorical. You can actually say it. Will you get healthier, or will it remain the same? Same? Who said that? Worse. I think it doesn't get better or remain the same. I actually do think it will, over time, get worse. Almost always, shadow environments attract, what have we learned from the palm? They attract and cultivate creatures that like the shadows, shadowy creatures, shadowy issues. So here's the, let me put something a little more tangible around this point. When I marry folks, my policy is they have to have mandatory sessions of premarital counseling. And in that counseling, one of the things that I talk about is that the new thing that's born into this marriage. It's two individuals, but when they come together and they say, I do, something brand new is born. But I say in that, when you come together as that couple, you bring with you some things that might be a little hidden. They may be a little shaded. May not know everything about the person. You know a lot, but you may not know everything, every aspect. May not know everything they need. May not know everything they want. And if you leave that alone over a span of years, meaning, that's my analogy, will it get better or remain the same? It will do neither. It will get worse. Because as time passes, those things that are hidden are still affecting the marriage. Now here's the point. Things left alone in the shadows, they seldom get better. That's meaning in our lives. And Jesus knows that's absolutely true. He knows it's true about our relationships and especially about our spiritual lives. That's why he calls us out of the shadows and calls us into the light. That's part of the point I was trying to make with the children this morning. He called himself what? The light. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Now, in the gospel we read today, Mark's gospel, Jesus is giving that rebuke to Peter. But then he says, before that, he's declaring to them that basically, I need to die. I'm going to die, and I need to die. And he said it very openly. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't in the shadows. And that's what got the response from Peter. But then he goes on, and he says toward the end of that passage, I tried to highlight that when I was reading it. He said many things, but the one thing I want to really focus on today was pick up your cross, right? Pick up your cross and follow me. Now, if I want to think about that in a very literal way today, if I want to visualize that, here's how my mind works. I think about it literally, and I think about this series of the Sacred Heart of palm reading and hiddenness that can harm, and I begin to realize picking up the cross may have more significance than I had imagined. I've preached on that passage before, and you've heard preachers preach on that passage before. But what about this? If we apply it to human life with the context of the Sacred Heart of palm reading. Even a cross laid on the ground. What does Jesus say? Pick up your cross. Well, it must have been somewhere. It must have been laid on the ground. He says, pick it up. Even a cross laid on the ground will very shortly, especially in Florida, create a dark environment. It's shadows, right? It's creating a shadow, creating moisture, and it'll foster growth of all kinds of organisms that can only survive in the dark, wet places. And if you want proof of that, right outside the door, when you go out today, I want you to look. There's 3 crosses. You ever notice the 3 crosses out there 3 wooden crosses. I noticed them too when I first came to this church. They've been there for 13 years plus. I don't know who put them in. Somebody here must know, but they were there when I got here. I guarantee if you pick those crosses up and you look at the bottom of the cross that's been in the ground, you're going to find organisms that can only survive in the dark and probably some rotted wood. You may find a few palmetto bugs too, right? Because it's on the ground, and shade creates a shadow environment, and nature will take its course. Jesus knew exactly what he was saying. The cross is most effective to us in living each day when we actually pick it up. We pick it up and we expose light to the places that were once dark. And that's, if you think about Jesus saying, pick up your cross and follow me, it makes sense. You can't follow Jesus with the cross on the ground. If you're laying a cross on the ground, it's stationary. It's not going anywhere. And Jesus is moving and he says, pick up your cross, follow me. It's very logical. Now, I hope I painted a picture for you today that we learned that underneath the shadow of the palm, often very bad things can exist, sometimes even dangerous things. In nature is fine, but some of those things can cause us harm because those creatures are drawn to the shadows and they can only exist in those shadow places. So what can we do about it? It's Lent. We're supposed to be a little more reflective, looking inside, kind of on a journey with Jesus. What can we learn? Well, I think we can learn, or we have already learned, that exposing the dark areas to some sunlight, meaning taking away the shade, taking away the shadow culture, all that stuff that likes that environment has a hard time thriving there, has a hard time living there. When I'm in my yard and I'm trimming, and I'm avoiding the wasp and all these other things, I'm trimming out these leaves that are going through the fronds that are going through the death cycle, and I trim them up, and you probably have either you trim them yourself or have somebody else trim your palms because they can grow mold and fungus on the underneath parts as it starts to die. If they fall on the ground, it can cause other things to happen. But I have flowers planted under my palms, and if I don't trim those palms up a little bit and let some light come in, those flowers don't really grow. It requires a bit of pruning, shaping up. And I think that's a great way to consider this Lenten journey we're on. Clear out some parts. Allow a bit of sunlight to shine in some areas of our lives. Allow it to shine in. It takes away the culture for funguses to grow. Works on plants, allows new things to grow up, works on plants. I think the same is true in human life. We need light in some of the shady areas. We need to remove that culture that only grows when we keep it away from Jesus. And then we allow new growth to come in. So now comes the hard part, because so far all you've done is listen to me talk this morning. I want you to listen to yourself, because I'm going to ask you a question. I truly want you to consider this. What would have a hard time living in your shadow areas, in our shadow areas, if we allowed just a little bit more light to shine in? Some creatures don't like the dark. They flee. What would have a hard time living? I want to give you one biblical example as we move to the end today. You've heard the story of the woman at the well. It's in John's Gospel, chapter 4. You can read that in 13 to 18. I'm not going to read that passage today. I think many of us are familiar with that. Jesus goes out to a well. There's a woman there. They have a whole conversation about water and living water. And I think what happens, if you go back and read that story, if I'm just going to summarize it, what happens, especially in the context of the Sacred Heart of Palm reading, what happens is Jesus allows a little light to shine into the shadow areas of her life. There's some of her life that's been a bit shadowy, been a bit hidden. Maybe she's a bit embarrassed about it. She doesn't know what to do. That's why she's out at the well at the time of day she's there drawing water. But he lets a little bit of light shine in to those areas. And here's the really interesting part of it. She participates in the process, right? She didn't run away. She didn't say, oh, no, you can't say that about me. Oh, it's not true. She didn't say, oh, you made me feel so guilty. I'll never listen to you. The light of truth that Jesus was pouring into her life promoted a sense of wellness in her. And instead of referring to her as the woman at the well, I'm going to give her a new name today. She was the well woman, right? She's a well woman. Why? A little bit of light, just a little bit of light. Often that's all it takes, a little bit more light to see truth in our lives, to bring out new life. And I think that's what Jesus wants today. Still, he wants to shine the light. He don't want to hurt us. Sometimes we think, oh, God just wants to hurt me, to sting me, to punish me. He wants to embarrass me. In fact, he wants us to thrive in the life he created. And Jesus knows the parts of our lives which are left in the shadows, in that shadow environment. He knows we can't leave them there. They don't get better. Might even cultivate some things that aren't good for us, hold us back in life. So if we get back to the palm leaf analogy, the palm fronds out there, if I think about it with the image of the palm, which we put out, we're in this series now, we're talking about the palm. I think Jesus helped her pull back some of those fronds, right? Pull back some of that shaded environment. Maybe something that had fallen down on the ground, too much covering in her life, allowed some stuff that wasn't healthy for her. He took a little bit of that shade away, a little bit of that shadow culture away. And some of those things that were hurting her had a hard time thriving there. That's why I think she became a well woman. You know, C.S. Lewis said people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargaining. You know, you're bargaining with God. You know, if you keep a lot of rules, God will reward us. And if we don't keep the rules, God will punish us. Lewis says, I don't think that's the best way to look at it at all. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you're either turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. That's a little bit of light shining. Allow something new to come up. He also goes on to say, if you don't, you know, if you stay in that dark area, some other things grow up that aren't good for us. So Wednesday, I said we have the Lenten devotionals. We were seated right here, and we were discussing the passage of the day, which happened to be where I started last week in the series with Jesus wandering in the wilderness. And we looked at the version in which Jesus has this little debate with Satan. And we talked about what that meant. The three things were offered, you know, stones to bread, test God, throw yourself down, and then worship Satan, actually. So we looked at those things. And I think there's a connection to what we've been talking about with this whole idea of the palms and the shadow and the light that I wanted to relate as we close, and it's this. We don't need to eat the stuff that's not really good for us, you know, stones. Not good for us, both physically and spiritually. That's one way to let light in. We don't need to run through life like we're plunging through the briar patch I talked about last week. We get hurt. Instead, we need to slow down. Spend some time, like the well woman, in conversation with Jesus. That'll let a little light in. And we don't need to look beyond God for some culture-driven reward. I think I've made the case, if you leave those things alone, shadow life will grow. So for Lent, I'm going to invite us all to do what Jesus said, to pick up the cross of Christ. And you go, oh, that's so hard. But we pick up crosses all the time. And a lot of them are shadowy, and they don't do anything for us. The cross of Christ, that's light. We pick up a behavior or a pattern that's destructive or dysfunctional, and we hold on to that. Maybe a relationship that's ended up gone bad in some way, unresolved grief that we just can't quite let go of yet. Maybe it's a career or a job that's no longer nurturing you. Or maybe we just need to die to some deadness in ourselves. Those are the things that we need to clear away. That's some of the ways we can let the light come in. So in the Sacred Heart of Palm reading would suggest to us today, we need to change the environment. If you can remember anything today, change the environment. Pick up the cross, Jesus' cross. Let the light shine in. The first focal point of a life that takes Jesus really seriously is a radical centering in him. And that's not a bad lesson taken from something as simple as a palm frond. Amen.